A while ago, Dr. Töppel suggested I could do a video on tank versus tank ramming. Since there are quite many misconceptions out there, and he provided me with sources and data, including some from his interviews with former German World War II veterans. Coincidentally, I visited the Military History Museum of the Bundeswehr in Dresden about that time, and spontaneously interviewed the military historian and former Leopard 1 driver Jens Wehner about ramming, while we were filming in the underground tank depot. And since this should be an in-depth video, I also asked a US Army officer Nicholas Moran, better known as the Chieftain, on his thoughts on the matter. Those interviews are on my second channel and are mostly related to post-World War II tank ramming, including the last known incident of tank ramming that occurred in 2020 in Syria. Yet in this video here, we cover the Second World War. But let us get started, and you know what that means in my case. Yes, German pre-war army regulations. In 1939, the German instructions for tanks were not to ram. Ramming even smaller enemy tanks is pointless. This usually results in damaging and immobilizing the ramming panzer. This is also repeated in a semi-official German publication from 1940, which notes in a wrong and right series, ramming the enemy tank is nonsense. Your own vehicle will be damaged. Completely destroy the enemy tank by fire. Similarly, the US Armored Forces Field Manual 1730 Tank Platoon from October 1942 notes, "Do not ram an enemy tank, your own tank may be rendered useless." This is repeated again on the same page. "Do not ram an enemy tank, destroy it by fire." This needs some further explanation. First off, it is important to remember that World War II tanks were quite unreliable compared to nearly every piece of equipment we have today. Well, maybe except Bethesda games, but those are software. Anyway, World War II tanks required regular maintenance and even during non-combat operations. For instance, the Anschluss, which was the German occupation of Austria in 1938, many tanks and other vehicles broke down. Yet I think the quote from Dixon about Soviet tank repair drives the point perfectly home. While it may not be obvious to the infantryman cowering in his foxhole as a tank approaches, tanks are vulnerable things, often operating at the limits of their engines and transmissions capabilities, and it doesn't take much to put them out of service. Another crucial aspect, of course, is also that tanks were and are expensive pieces of equipment. As such, they should be used with care. Interestingly enough, by 1943, this view might have changed a bit. A pamphlet released by the Sturmgeschützschule in October 1943 gives instructions on what is important if one rams. When ramming, drive with the center of the assault gun towards the enemy running gear. Pay attention to the protruding barrel. Yet there are a few problems here. First, it does not mention explicitly that the target of the ramming is a tank. Yet Laufwerk, which is probably best translated with running gear, is usually used for tanks. Still, this could mean a regular vehicle like a truck. Note that although I found mentions of ramming or better driving over anti-tank guns or artillery in at least one German wartime publication, when it comes to driving over regular vehicles, I have not come across anything so far. But there are even more problems. This regulation is from 1943. By that time, most Sturmgeschütze with short barrels were gone. As such, the instructions are a bit contradictory. Unless the object to be rammed is extremely low, since A, the Stug should ram with its center. Yet B, this is exactly the location where the gun barrel is located, and it can't be turned away. Furthermore, Stugs are rather low as well. I also talked with Nicholas Moran, aka the Chieftain, about this line in the manual.
Also wonder if that was put into the manual to make the superior of whoever was writing the manual think that the person who was writing the manual had aggressive intent. I don't know if anybody specifically looked at this part of the manual and said, this is a brilliant idea, I'm going to follow it. So, Colonel Schmidt is writing this manual and he wants to make General, whoever the hell's in charge of him, happy and think he's a good aggressive commander. I want to put him in the field. Oh, whatever he wants to. I'm going to put this really aggressive thing. I'm going to emphasize the aggressive spirit in this manual so that my boss thinks that I'm aggressive. And then I can get a good posting or something. I don't know. As I said, so the only other thing that I can think of is if it didn't mean attacking vehicles of equal weight. So if a Sturmgeschütz 3 comes up a Bren carrier, does it really need to use a 7.5 centimeter round against a Bren carrier? Ramming anything with a Stug is inherently, it seems to be an act of desperation.
Additionally, I asked Jens Wehner about the entry in the Sturmgeschütz pamphlet. His educated guess is that during combat there could be various situations where ramming could appear as an option. As such, it was likely added to the pamphlet to give a general guideline on how to do it, namely ramming the running gear and if possible preserve the barrel. And if we look at what happened between 1940 and 1943, there are some incidents that sustain such an interpretation. During Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans several times encountered Soviet tanks that their guns could not penetrate, and ramming was a last resort. One incident that is documented also by photos was a Sturmgeschütz ramming a T-34. In October 1941, south of Kalinin, nowadays Tver, the Stug and the T-34 interlocked a bit like this. Now in the book, the scene is only shown from the left side. In this picture, the Stug looks mainly intact. Yet on tank archives, there's a photo that depicts a similar or same scene, although from the other side. The main difference is that in this case, the Stug's drive wheel on this side is completely knocked off, which seems in line with German and US early war regulations. The incident from the memoir is described as follows. A Sturmgeschütz, which immediately had been in pursuit of the first Russian tank, was suddenly hit from behind. That is fired upon from the second Russian tank. It turns around and takes the attacker under fire, but even the shots fired from a distance of only 10 meters do nothing against the Russian Colossus. Then the two tanks ram each other. With bloody heads, the Russians are taken out and captured. I'm generally rather skeptical about such accounts, yet let us assume most of the information is correct here. In that case, it might have been that the T-34 was actually trying to ram the Stug. At least it must have been moving. Since if the T-34 was static, the impact of the Stug ramming it would likely have a limited effect on the Soviet crew. Of course, this raises the question, why would the T-34 try to ram the Stug if it had previously fired at the Stug before it turned around? Yet there's another issue, the mention of that at 10 meters distance the fire of the Stug had no effect. This would indicate that the shot was fired during movement, unless the Stug moved away again to take a run up to ram the T-34. Since if it was only 10 meters away before, the distance is simply not enough to build up any amount of speed for a ram, let alone that one depicted in the pictures. So this account raises more questions than it provides answers. Luckily, we have accounts that seem to be confirmed by both sides. Glantz particularly notes this instance. Fuel and ammunition were in short supply, many tank guns were not bore-sighted and could not fire, and most of the mechanized corps tank drivers had received minimal if any training. As a result, 2 days after the war began, a battalion of KV tanks assigned to the 3rd Mechanized Corps' 2nd Tank Division went into combat against the German 6th Panzer Division near Rasinya, Lithuania, with orders to ram the enemy tanks, since its 30 KV tanks had not been bore-sighted and could not fire. And a German colonel of the 6th Panzer Division noted about an attack by KV tanks on that day. The super heavy Soviet KV tanks advanced against our tanks, which concentrated their fire on them without visible effect. The command tank of the company was rammed and turned over by a KV, and the commander was injured. The next question is, how often did tank versus tank ramming actually occur? I've seen some numbers on the internet that note that tank ramming was rather uncommon. The main issue is they didn't cite any sources, even if numbers were mentioned. Now I do not have a perfect answer here neither, yet luckily Dr. Roman Töppel years ago interviewed several German World War veterans that served in tank units. Be aware that this data should be taken with a grain of salt, since the number of asked veterans is clearly not statistically significant. Yet that is the best we have and should give you some idea. In total, 19 former tankers and Sturmgeschützmen were questioned. Of these, only one noted that he thinks that a tank wanted to ram him. Another one mentioned that there was an incident where a Soviet tank only stopped about 8 meters in front of his vehicle. Yet he did not interpret this as a ramming attack. He assumed that the crew of the tank likely was wounded or dead after the first hit and the tank continued to move without control. The other 17 mentioned that they didn't experience it. 3 of them mentioned that they heard of incidents. One of them described that Soviet tanks tried to ram German half-tracks, which tried also to ram Soviet tanks. Interestingly enough, one mentioned that if something like that happened, it was an accident. And finally, one denied vehemently that something like that happened. In various German memoirs, there are further incidents mentioned that include tank rammings or trying to ram other tanks or half-tracks. Yet likely the most known instance of tank ramming happened at the Battle of Kursk. This also stems from the fact that the Battle of Kursk memorial shows T-34s ramming Tigers in the side. Yet probably the main reason is the famous Russian description of tank ramming at Kursk by Koltunov and Solovyev. As quoted by the Russian historian Valery Samulin, "Soon our tanker's machine took a second direct hit and burst into open flames. Choking in the smoke, Shalandin made another attempt to fire over open sights, but the damaged cannon poorly responded to the wounded commander. Then he decided to ram a hostile Tiger. Flaming, the T-34 went into motion, struck the Tiger's flank with full force. The enemy tank caught fire and its fuel tanks exploded." Yet Salumin points out that this incident is not backed up by sources. However, in the commendation of Shalandin, there is not even a mention of the ramming episode. The document states, "Despite the enemy's constant bombing and artillery fire, Comrade Shalandin heroically fought for 10 hours. Comrade Shalandin burned to death in the tank on the very spot where his platoon had been ordered to hold the defense." Although this T-34 ramming Tiger scene likely did not happen, we have at least one example in the German records that suggests that several German half-tracks had been damaged by ramming at the Battle of Kursk. The entry into the war diary for the 14th of July notes that 15 3-ton half-tracks, likely Sonderkraftfahrzeuge 251, were rammed by T-34s, and thus the front axles were damaged. And if the following Soviet award nomination is correct, ramming occurred even in late war. During the battle for the Sarats settlement on March 18th, 1945, he was the first to burst into the village, where he destroyed 2 cannons, 8 armored personnel carriers, and over 20 fascists with his tracks. He encountered a German self-propelled gun unexpectedly at a crossroad and destroyed it by ramming. Although note, I assume that this was probably a mobility kill and the award very likely is more related to the other achievements than the ramming, but I'm no expert on Soviet awards. Also, Tank Archives now has a YouTube channel. Be sure to check out the link in the pinned comment. Yet what is very interesting are the thoughts of the Soviet General Babachayan on tank ramming. In his memoirs he noted, "The ramming of an enemy tank, as enticing as it might be as a description in the artistic literature or for journalism, was one of the exceptional phenomena. Not because there was a lack of heroes, but because a tank was not an aircraft and the earth was not the sky. It was not bad to throw a tank into a ditch or overturn it, but most of the time it hardly moved when rammed, but in return one's own vehicle was badly damaged." This is pretty much in line with both the German and US Army regulations statements. Furthermore, he notes, "A tank is designed to approach the enemy at firing range and then fight him with its fire. To tear up one's tracks on the enemy's armor is literally suicide." Although he notes one notable exception, namely the situation when one's tank was burning and there was no rescue. In this situation, ramming was deemed justified. Finally, we also have an account from the Western Front where, according to a British commander, his Sherman rammed intentionally a Königstiger. Yet this is contested by a German gunner who notes that his own commander was a noob that did not spot the Sherman while moving backwards after he panicked. The German author Schneider concludes from both reports and the photographs that the account by the British commander is incorrect. Although some arguments by Schneider seem valid, others seem less so. As such, I will present you with the most important parts of the British and German eyewitness accounts, then add a few of my thoughts, and you can draw your own conclusions. First, the British commander's account. 2 or 3 groups, each with 4 or 5 Tigers that were making good use of the cover, seemed to be opposing our 5th Guards Armored Brigade. They would suddenly emerge from their cover, fire, and cost us several losses. So much for the general setup, he continues. This was my first time in action, and I was excited. I had got across the little stream running into Cagney from the northeast. But the rest of my troop, Usually 4 tanks, 3 Shermans and 1 Sherman Firefly, got stuck. However, I pushed on alone for a bit and found plenty of targets and was beginning to think this war business was not too bad after all. In fact, I was beginning to enjoy myself. But this didn't last long for. On glancing to my left, I saw, to my horror, the unmistakable shape of a royal tiger coming through a hedge under 200 yards away. After this significant emotional event, he reacted. I ordered my gunner, traverse left on, fire. He fired and I saw with dismay. The 75mm shot hit the front of the tiger, bounce off and go sizzling up into the air. I ordered the gunner to fire again, but a hollow voice came up from the bowels of the tank saying "Gun jammed, sir." This was a situation for which I had not been trained and I did not know what to do. Glancing anxiously at the tiger, I saw with horror that his long gun was slowly swinging around in my direction. Someone had once told me that when in doubt the thing to do was advance, so I ordered my driver to advance at full speed and ram the tiger. We lurched forward, gathered speed, and hit him amidships with a terrific crash just before he got his sights on me. Both crews bailed out on impact, and since there was quite heavy shelling, both crews dived for cover. My wireless operator saw a convenient slit range and jumping into it found it already occupied by the tiger's crew. However, they both stayed there together, keeping their heads down. I crawled back, brought up my 17-pounder Sherman and managed to brew the tiger. Now the German gunner's account, which starts with the general situation as well. We could scarcely keep the hatches open because of the ongoing artillery fire. The attack that started at around 1500 hours was supported by a tremendous number of British tanks. The main line of resistance was overrun in a few minutes. Only the 1st Company and a few anti-tank guns held for a little time. Soon the British were between, in front of and behind us. That had as a result that neither we nor the English knew who or what was where. In the meantime, both the German and English artillery fired widely into the midst of it all. And of course the British and German infantry were right in there too. The situation for the King Tiger and crew is described as: Tiger 112, the tank in which I was gunner, was engaged with 1 Englishman while we were fired on by others. That caused my tank commander, a newcomer without combat experience, to, well, let's say, to have the tank put in reverse almost in a panic. We lunged back right through a hedge, the type you usually found there. This is followed by the description of the ramming incident. Obviously, the commander was a bit out of it, since he must have seen that another tank was behind the hedge. In any case, there was a jolt and we were hung up with an Englishman. There was no way that we intended to ram the enemy, the more so since we ran into him with the rear of the tank and I was still at 12 o'clock busy with the Tommy that was firing at us. Scarcely had we run into the Englishman when apparently a 75mm puck firing at the Englishman hit us instead. It hit us in the left between the track and the running gear. The round penetrated and sliced the seat right out from under my backside. I found myself on the turret floor. At the same time, the round tore open my shell casing, and the propellant charge ignited in a jet of flame. There was nothing for us but to bail out. There are some differences in the account, whereas the German account states that this was basically an accident caused by a frightened German tank commander. The British account states that a single Sherman continued after the other tanks of its troop, aka platoon, got stuck, pushed forward against a serious threat without support. Generally, the British account seems rather polished, yet we have some photo evidence that clearly denies one of the British claims. Glancing anxiously at the tiger, I saw with horror that his long gun was slowly swinging around in my direction. We lurched forward, gathered speed and hit him amidships with a terrific crash, just before he got his sights on me. The photo shows that the gun of the Königsegg is about 35 degrees to the left, but the Sherman hit from an angle, where the tiger's gun is about 90 degrees towards the Sherman. So just before he got his sights on me is a bit off. Of course, the German gunner's account might be incorrect here as well. There was no way that we intended to ram the enemy, the more so since we ran into him with the rear of the tank and I was still at 12 o'clock, busy with the Tommy that was firing at us. Of course, in this case we don't know if he referred to 12 o'clock in regards of the tank which would be incorrect considering the position of the bell, yet if it was about 12 o'clock of the turret, it would be correct. Another issue is that although previously the British commander engaged the Königstiger alone, since his troop was stuck, yet then without problems nor delays he can bring forward his German Firefly. What was everyone else doing at the time, the Germans, the British, etc.? I generally think the German account is closer to what happened since it is less self-serving. Yet it also raises some questions like the friendly fire incident. Schneider seems to be convinced that the British account is mostly incorrect. The issue is he brings forward points that are hard to confirm for me from the evidence provided in his book. For instance, in front of the Tiger, the tracks of the backwards driven tank are clearly visible with a sharp turn to the left, so towards the Sherman. This proves that it had rammed the Sherman. Schneider refers here to a photo from the Canadian archives, but I'm not sure if it is in his book. He included several images in the book about this incident, but I couldn't see any evidence for this. Although it should be mentioned that Schneider is a former armor officer, so he might be more perceptive. Had better photos than those that were printed in his book, or the mentioned photo was not included, because I simply can't see any indication of the ruts on the grass at all, let alone the mentioned turn. Additionally, Schneider notes that the Sherman clearly was hit on the side on the turret by a German pack. Now this is visible to me, but this side faces the same direction as the Königstiger's turret, which should face toward the Allied side according to both the German and British accounts. Not to mention that we simply cannot know when this hit occurred or if it was friendly fire. In short, I'm rather suspicious about the British tank commander's claim here, but from the current evidence available I can only deny the aforementioned note about the gun position. Although the German account seems far less self-serving, especially the full version that includes passages like this. On dismounting through the turret hatch, I landed on a member of the English crew who presumably was also somewhat out of it. Apparently he thought I was one of his crew. For a moment we looked at each other in a daze, then a rush of heroism awoke in both of us. Each grabbed for the place where he would usually find his pistol. Heroism failed from a lack of lethal materials. Generally, such accounts are often influenced by self-interest, as pointed out in discussion with Dr. Roman Töppel on who lied more, officers or regular soldiers. I know nothing about the German gunner, but the British commander later on had a rather distinguished and successful civilian career, and ultimately also became a politician according to his site on British armor officers, that give his autobiography as a source. To conclude, from the information that is currently available to me, at least the German and similarly the US forces initially clearly noted in their regulation that tank versus tank ramming should not be performed. It seems that the Germans might have adapted their view, likely due to several incidents during Operation Barbarossa. But the explanations in German and US regulations in combinations with the remarks of the Soviet general indicate that tank ramming was a last-ditch effort to neutralize an enemy, yet thereby putting one's own vehicle at a high risk as well. Furthermore, although there are a few photos of rammed tanks out there, it was very likely a rare occurrence. And even some of those photos might have been the result of an accident rather than an intentional ramming. Remember, the crew is almost blind in a World War II tank during combat that is buttoned up, meaning hatches closed. Big thank you here to Dr. Roman Töppel for bringing up this topic and providing me with access to his notes and many sources on the matter. Thank you to Jens Wehner, Chieftain and Peter Samsonov for further input and support. Special thanks to Andrew for reviewing the script. And of course, thank you to the Militärhistorische Museum der Bundeswehr Dresden for inviting me. As always, sources are listed in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.